Hello all, welcome to our podcast, The Prescription on Earshot Media. I am your host, Dr. Karan Thakur. I hope you're all safe and your mind is healthy. This past week marked the World Mental Health Day, and in this episode, we will talk about mental health and how it has played out during the pandemic. We'll also be joined by Dr. Achal Bhagat, Senior Consultant in the Department of Psychiatry at Indraprastha Apollo Hospitals, New Delhi, and discuss issues around mental health and how the COVID pandemic has impacted our mental health and well-being.
Indraprastha Apollo Hospitals presents The Prescription in association with Earshot.in.
The coronavirus pandemic knocked our socks off with its suddenness and swiftness when it began in 2020. The rapid rise had us by surprise. Human beings paid a heavy price for it. A price, unfortunately, that we are still paying for. Unknowingly, as infections and deaths marred the world, fear found its haven in our minds. Like the virus, fear too seeped in us silently but rapidly. The fear of catching the infection, the fear of stepping out of our house, the fear of not wearing a mask, the fear of infecting others, or the fear of spreading the virus to our loved ones. Be it the virus or the myth surrounding it, fear remained constant. Once fear seeped in, it didn't take time to find its sister, anxiety. And then, all hell broke loose. We all know fear and anxiety go hand in hand, a lethal combination. The pandemic has disrupted our ordered lives and impacted our mental well-being more than at any time previously. A KFF health tracking poll concluded that during the pandemic, about 4 in 10 adults in the US have reported symptoms of anxiety or depression. This number is up from 1 in 10 adults who reported these symptoms from January 2019 to June 2019, that is before the pandemic. The flu has us worried, something we used to fight previously with a plain paracetamol. So, Dr. Bhagat, welcome to our podcast.
Hi, Karan. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. So, Dr. Bhagat, let me begin by asking how important is mental health?
Mental health is extremely important, especially in COVID times. What is mental health? Let's focus on that first. Mental health is our search for dignity, our search for a purpose in our life, our search for belongingness, our search for being in control of our own objectives and how we pursue them, being in control of the demands that are placed on us and the resources we put into play to fulfill those demands that are placed on us. Now, if we do not have mental health, then we have isolation, we have loss of control, we have lack of purpose, we have lack of dignity. Now, who does not want dignity, purposefulness, belongingness, and control in their lives? So, if we want all those things, then we obviously want positive mental health.
So in that sense, for physical ailments, it's very easy. I get a pain, I know that something is not right. But for mental health, it's slightly tougher. So how can one know whether your mental state of being is good or bad? Or how do you characterize it?
Right. So again, people get confused between mental health and mental ill health. Right? Just as in physical health, there's a continuum that you have health on one side, which means that you eat well, you sleep well, you exercise, you feel good about yourself. That's all a part of physical health. Similarly, in mental health, you have thoughts, feelings, emotions, moods, and there's a range of emotions. It's not that you're always happy or you can be sad, worried occasionally, you can cope with it. That's all positive mental health. You can have problems and you can solve them. That's all positive mental health. Move further on the continuum. On the other extreme, you could have illnesses where you could have impairment of thought, where you might feel helpless or hopeless all the time. You might feel sad or anxious all the time. You might worry. You might not be able to cope with uncertainty. You might be angry all the time. And by all the time, I mean sustained change of mood or thoughts for 2 weeks of time. And then you might lose contact with reality, you might lose insight into your difficulties, and it might distress you to the level that you might stop functioning in your everyday life. Now, that's the range. Most people somewhere fall somewhere in between. They have a few symptoms, their sleep might not be good, their appetite might not be good. But if you have a change of mood, thought, or behavior which has lasted more than 2 weeks, and you're feeling distressed and you're not able to do your day to day things, better to seek help than not to seek help.
In August, a TOI report had carried that a man in West Bengal died of COVID 19, and hours later, unable to fathom the grief, his wife and daughter hung themselves from a ceiling fan. Another news report said that a couple in Karnataka died by hanging, fearing they may have contracted the virus. They had developed some early symptoms. Such is the fear ingrained in us. We have become an anxious society. When the pandemic had started to spread, and people were only beginning to realize the true nature of the virus, its impact started being felt far beyond the realm of health. All of a sudden, people lost their jobs. Some faced a dip in their incomes, while others faced a financial crisis or were unable to make ends meet. The ones who lost their jobs faced anxiety on a daily basis of finding another one, while many just lived in the fear of losing their jobs. It had become taxing for humans to cope.
So, at what stage should one be self-aware and not get hypervigilant? Because that can also happen, that you tend to look at each symptom and then try to get to a diagnosis too quickly. So, how should one balance that?
Doing 3 or 4 or 5 things every day. One, at the end of the day, reflecting how was my day. Did I feel good today? Did I smile today? Was I able to maintain my relationships today? Did I feel a sense of belonging today? Did I feel a sense of purposefulness today? Did I enjoy myself today? These questions, if the answer to that is yes, you are doing well for yourself. And to be able to answer yes to these questions, you have to balance your life. You have to balance between work and life. You have to have regular habits on sleep and appetite. You have to have not use addictive substances. You have to have friendships. You have to share with what's happening for you, and you have to reflect about what's happening for yourself.
Right. Job losses, economic stresses. COVID-19 has really thrown the entire bucket list at us. So, why do you think COVID-19 has caused this, and what has been the impact of COVID-19, given that it has caused all this economic disruption in people's lives? So, how has it affected mental health in people?
I was just talking to somebody. Their working capital got exhausted. They're filing for bankruptcy. It's not happened to 1 or 2 or 5 people. It's happened to a whole range of businesses, hospitality, for example. A number of people who were support workers at homes, in the unorganized sector, even in the farming sector. The opportunities have gone down significantly. And because the opportunities have gone down, not only people who have lost jobs have been affected, but people who were then supported by them because they bought things and they kept their families going, they have been affected as well.
This entire chain, which
this is, you can go upwards or downwards, and and then the wider population has been affected because there's so much uncertainty that exists. You might have a job today, but tomorrow you might not have a job. And I've known organizations, people with 15, 20 years of good working experience, even healthcare professionals doing well for themselves, have suddenly found themselves at a point where their expenses have been committed, but their incomes have been low. So livelihood and the status that comes with that, the acknowledgement that comes with that, not just the money, everything has been affected. And this is going to remain affected for a long time. For example, we are working with a voluntary organization in Gujarat. The number of people who've returned to the village. Now, in a village, mostly people had migrated outside and they were outside. But now that everybody's come back, the opportunities are in the village are lesser. So who gets fired the most quickly? Women are doing lesser jobs and they are getting lesser pays for the jobs that they're doing. Uh, if you were to look at the inequality, then the poor people are obviously more affected, and their mental health is more affected, and they don't have resources for mental health. So it's a domino effect. It's a ripple effect that we can't even imagine. I continue to say that mental health is the slow pandemic that will be with us for the next 5 years. COVID is a pandemic that is visible, but mental health is the pandemic that is going to be with us for a very, very long time.
You brought up a very interesting aspect, which is that the financial stress also has a bearing on our stature and standing in society. Both are actually quite interlinked. And because of this distress, your perceived attitudes about yourself also change, and that impacts your mental health.
Just take a small example, a TV news story about parents not having been able to pay fees for their children. Now imagine what that father or mother would be going through, that the school is asking them for fees. They're not able to pay that fees. The child is not being able to attend the online classes. Now the impact that has, that I can't be the provider that I was supposed to be, obviously there's a mental health impact. It might not be a disorder,
But it impacts.
it is a significant impact. It disempowers you. And then there's nobody that you can complain to or say to, because everybody is going through the same thing. So who do you seek support from? What do you say? Who do who do you get angry with? So this disenfranchisement is also there. There's disempowerment, there's a loss of voice, there's a loss of acknowledgement, there's a loss of status, and there's a universality of that. So you can't even feel angry about having gone through a rough time.
So wide swathes of the society is impacted, but what demographics are you seeing in your clinics or in your practice that has shown the maximum disruption in their mental health, or at least
It's across the board. It's across the board. And as you know, that I work in different kinds of scenarios. I work as a voluntary organization and I work at Apollo. So at one level, we are seeing these difficulties in villages, these difficulties in urban poverty areas, increased number of violence, increased human trafficking, increased problems of inequality in education. All these problems are very visible and stark in one aspects of my work, and that leading to low mood, depression, anger, increased alcoholism. At another level, increased substance use, marital discord, anxiety, depression, loss of people, grieving, sadness. It is a sea of difficulties.
And as you pointed out, there are a lot of issues that come out of the disruption that one is seeing. So how has this impacted relations, like for example, between a spouse or spouse between them, or between parents and their children? Are we seeing different things happening to different relationships?
So in a universal sense, yes. I think people need space from each other. Even if they're the closest people to each other, they need space from each other. And when we were working in our own work environments, we would provide that space to each other. Now, when everybody's at home, there's a blurring of roles, there's a blurring of decision making. Patriarchy is becoming even more evident. If the men are at home, that they're taking the decisions, violence is increasing. There are two kinds of communication difficulties that are coming up. One is called intent assumptions, and the second is called impact assumptions. People are doubting each other's intent in a relationship. And then secondly, people are minimizing in their own mind as to what their method of communication or what they're saying is doing to the other person. So this attribution of intent and minimization of impact is leading to significant difficulties in relationships. And it's not just marital relationships. It is across the board. with parents, with friends, with extended family, with children. So these assumptions are valid across the board. Of course, there is a small subset of people, not a very significant small subset of people who've lost their spouses, who've lost their family members, or who've come so close to losing people and have felt the helplessness of that. And that inability to have, the lack of opportunity to have grieved for somebody or to have supported somebody, and the suddenness of that is also immense at this point of time.
And what about the younger population? I was going to go and take up a course overseas that's been disrupted. I was going to start a job. I was just getting into the job market after having studied for years, and that's probably delayed or worse. How does that news or fact impact one's mental health, especially for that age group and demographic?
So eventually what it leads to is a significant amount of demoralization of a society, right? When you do not have opportunity, what do you do? When you've tried your best and you do not have opportunity, what do you do? That sense of helplessness weighs you down for years together. Then what you end up doing, you could either withdraw into yourself and be sad or depressed, or you could externalize what you're feeling and be angry or upset or protest, or there could be increase in violence, there could be increase in substance use. So it could either be internalization or externalizing the problems, and all this is happening. It's not that it is hypothetical or theoretical. Every day, young people who have been thwarted by this pandemic and the response to it are feeling quite at the brink of where and helpless and not being able to define what is success for them now.
Not just youngsters, school-going children underwent changes too. Schools had been suspended for over a year and a half because of the lockdown. The routine that the school instilled in children now stood disrupted. Parents complained that their children went to bed late and lethargy had set in. Parents also feared that the agile minds of their children may go into a slumber. It is important for children to communicate with their peers or to be supervised by a teacher, but all this came to a halt when schools were shut. The lockdown was particularly hard for children with special needs. This sudden suspension of schools did not bode well with these children. Their confusion and frustration grew by the day, resulting in chaotic outbursts.
So in this section, I'd like to just briefly touch upon the fact that as it is in India, it's difficult for children with special needs to get access to care, both in terms of physical and their mental health requirements. And COVID-19 probably made the situation worse. What has been your assessment for access of care to such children with special needs, especially for mental health?
The word special needs in itself actually puts people out of the circle, because once you start calling something special, then you start making special provisions for them rather than making the ordinary inclusive. So the way I look at it is nobody's needs are special. Everybody's needs are the same. Everybody needs health, education, relationships. Everybody's needs are the same. What needs to be special is the inputs that go in to make people access those services only. That input has not been there. It was not. In India, 90% of people who have mental health needs because of mental health problems are not able to access mental health services, right?
90%.
90%. And that's a Delhi number. Forget Bahraich, forget, Etawah.
And this is with or without COVID. So
this is with or without COVID.
This has been with us.
So that 90% would have become 95%. The restlessness and the helplessness would have increased even further. So there's a lack of acknowledgement about mental health in our society. There is a lot of talk about it now, right? For children, schools are organizing webinars. I'm doing another webinar for 200 teachers in a few weeks. I've done a few, 100 webinars in the last 2 years. for various groups of people. But mental health processes have to be processes and not events. You can't provide for mental health through webinars. You have to provide services which are ongoing. And services need human resources. Services need a policy. Services need a political will to put the service in place. That, unfortunately, all these are missing in the mix.
It isn't easy to talk about mental health in Indian families. The term mental health in Indian families has different connotations, unfortunately. People live through depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorders without realizing and acknowledging the mental illness. And so it has become particularly difficult for youngsters to talk about the disruptions taking place inside their minds. This lack of an outlet often leads to choices that one regrets or sadly even worsen the condition.
So, Dr. Bhagat, why is it so difficult in Indian families or in traditional setups to talk about mental health, even today?
There's a stigma about it. And there are, again, two assumptions we as a society have about mental health. One, anybody who has mental health problems would be somehow inadequate, and thus not need as much as the others. And the second, so that assumption of incapacity, that a person with mental health problems is somehow incapable of X number of things. That incapacity adds to the stigma. But what adds to the stigma even more so is a question of dangerousness. So the person cannot take decisions about themselves and they may be dangerous to someone else. And these two assumptions, nobody wants to then be seen as a person with a mental health problem. People, as I said, at one level, people will say, oh, mental health is very important. But then you ask them, would you actually, reach out for mental health support yourself? Oh, but I don't have that kind of a problem.
It's a defensive attitude.
It is a defensive attitude. And that stigma, that self-stigma, because there's a fear of being discriminated if you disclose mental health problems, and which is true as well. I keep on telling this story about a vice president from an insurance company that I treated who wanted insurance for himself, could not get insurance from his own company because he disclosed a mental health problem. Now, if that is the degree of discrimination that exists,
it's at so many levels.
It's at so many levels.
It's not just an Indian. And is this a uniquely Indian phenomena, or the world over, your experience tells you that this is fairly common still even the world over?
It is not something that is unique to us. The greatest amount of resources that are being spent in England are on mental health. The difference is that while there is an acknowledgement of the gap there, and thus an input and a continuous effort to evolve there, I think of mental health as a cherry on the top of a cake.
It isn't confirmed that COVID-19 posed a higher risk of miscarriage in pregnant women. It was, however, reported that there was a higher rate of maternal and neonatal complications in COVID-19 positive pregnant women. The pandemic shot up levels of anxiety and depressive symptoms in pregnant women.
Dr. Bhagat, how has the pandemic impacted pregnant women, their mental health?
Okay, again, while COVID is important, I want to mention the figures pre-COVID. 10% of women in postpartum have a mental health problem.
10% of all women
who give birth have a mental health problem. 10% is a huge number. My mother has postpartum depression. It was not diagnosed till I became a psychiatrist 40 years, 20, 30 years later.
Much too late.
Much too late. And then she was not willing for treatment. So a number of people who have mental health problems in the postpartum period get ignored. And that then presents as physical problems, that presents as relationship problems, that presents as so many other things. Women get excluded from mental health services, significantly so, because it is seen as this happens. How does it, it doesn't make too much of a difference if this happens. So women get excluded from mental health
And
service
some
delivery.
amount of victim shaming also, that it is a problem to do with your emotions or you're not strong enough.
That's true. That's true. There is a significant amount of gaslighting, which is a new word that I'm learning now. It's not in my vocabulary, but there's a significant amount of gaslighting that happens. If you have a mental health problem, that it might be that you who are causing it to yourself.
Therapists have been in high demand these past few months, and so therapists delivered mental health care digitally at affordable prices. Therapy is a reasonable solution, but an expensive one. Mental health issues in India are considered a fancy of the rich. Turns out, people, mostly youngsters, book maximum appointments for remote therapy. One psychologist has recently expressed surprise on Twitter that she had been seeing over 40 people a day for therapy ever since the pandemic started.
To what extent does therapy help? For a lot of people, it seems like a never-ending commitment. Is it so? And how should one approach it?
So therapy is not a magic pill, right? Therapy is a process. What is it a process about? It is a process to understand your patterns of behavior, thinking, and feeling. See how they're linked, understand how you can challenge those patterns if they are unhelpful, and how you can use those patterns if they are helpful, right? It is a process of learning about yourself. There's no mystique about therapy. Now, unfortunately, the therapeutic training in India is lacking, right? So somehow people add mystique to the word therapy and make it seem like a washing machine that you have to enter and come out of. It's not that. It's not something that you do in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. At a minimum, 6 sessions would help. At a maximum, 36 sessions would help. And if you're not being helped with 36 sessions, then you need to sit back and review what the goals for therapy are and whether you're moving in the right direction, it's the application of the learning also that matters, right? So what India needs is increased access to therapeutic interventions, but the therapeutic interventions have to be evidence-based, and there has to be a lot more effort to build the skill base and the capacity of the mental health professionals to be able to provide mental health services in a psychological manner.
People often struggle during quarantine as well, whether the infected were tended by family members or were living alone. Loneliness somehow found its way in. The talk around mental health has already started, but it peaked after the devastating second wave. Many people were unable to process grief. The 3 months, March, April, and May of 2021, were the most horrific period India has ever seen in recent times, and especially so for healthcare workers. Day in and day out, doctors and nurses were on call amid the mounting cases. Imagine their state of being.
So I remember during the second wave, it was quite terrible for all of us. We had shortages of beds. We could not help everybody. Oxygen shortages, and generally there was a lot of despair. And my colleagues, myself, everybody, we were really distressed during COVID-19 as healthcare workers. I remember, having conversations about how to deal with this stress, and a lot of us were, asking these questions because we had not seen this before. What has your experience been vis-a-vis COVID-19, the second wave, mental health, and its impact on healthcare workers?
It's been significant, I think. Most of my friends and I myself went through stressful situations, are continuing to go through stressful situations. You see, COVID is not over for the healthcare worker, right? We are still sitting with masks, and we are still sitting in the OPDs 8 hours a day with a mask on. Try being a psychiatrist with a mask on for 8 hours a day. It's impossible. Try being a manager trying to placate angry people who have not got beds. You went through hell during those days, didn't you? Try being a healthcare worker wanting to have a bed for themselves and not getting a bed.
Which also happened.
It happened for me. I had to wait for a bed for a couple of days when I needed it. So the stress of being a healthcare worker and then being in a place where you are supposed to deliver services without a systemic support for delivery of that service, it is not only is it it is this disempowering again. I as a frontline worker cannot control the system that lies behind it, and the system that lies behind it cannot control the wider macro picture at any point of time. So that helplessness is still visible, and some people become brave through this and are able to take risks and do things that they might not have done earlier. Some people have lost their lives, some people have lost opportunity, but most people have got burnt out. And we talk about doctors, but we forget to talk about nurses, forget to talk about housekeeping staff, and they had it much worse than the doctors did, because we still were recognized as the frontline workers. All those people were not even, the person who was providing the pots and pans in the wards was much more at risk and also very unsure of and did not have the information as to what is going to happen to them.
Are you seeing a lot of burnout happening in healthcare professionals and the...
A number of my friends have taken decisions to retire. A number of my friends have moved from one city to the other. A number of my friends are downsizing their work, closing some of the work that they were doing. So a number of people are in the word that people are using is consolidation. A number of people are reflecting back on what is it that they want. And a lot of younger people are also looking at where the opportunity is. So what we will have is the people of my generation will start retiring earlier, and people of 2 generations below, the forthcoming human resource will start migrating to safer places. And believe me, we are looking at a healthcare crisis which is going to be much more significant. So if COVID was to re-hit us in 3 years' time, or even the third wave, the energy that the healthcare system will be able to put in would have decreased because of the mental health problems that the healthcare professionals have had.
So if one is going through some symptoms of burnout, or you feel like you're burnt out, what can one do?
Now we're talking solutions.
Yes.
After talking about work and the worries all this while. I think recognizing that mental health is important, sharing what you're going through, trying to divide problems into small parts and deal with the small parts rather than trying to deal with the whole thing at the same time, containing the worrying time to a assigned time during a day or a week, and for the system to put in place healthcare services, mental healthcare services for healthcare professionals, assigned healthcare services for healthcare professionals, and a lot of flow of information. You see, it's the lack of information that causes most pain in a time like this. So if people had information about mental health, about how to go about it, they would recover faster.
The perpetual rise in COVID deaths took a massive toll on our minds. Mental health issues started to surface and forced people to start a dialogue around it. Post the second wave, it became crucial to check on your loved ones. The whole human race was experiencing such unprecedented sorrow all at once. Mental health awareness, therefore, became the need of the hour.
So in this section, I'd like to talk about the solutions, what we can do as individuals or as a caregiver or as colleagues. We all know that, mental health issues have increased or surfaced during COVID-19, as you mentioned earlier. So what can be done? What are some of the ways with which we can address this issue as an individual first?
As I said, be mindful if you are having a mental health problem. Be mindful that you need to balance work and life. Be mindful that you need to contain your worry by worrying about it in a purposeful, productive manner. Be mindful that you can seek support from people around you. Sharing and talking about your difficulties does help. Be aware that if you have a change of thought, feeling, or behavior for 2 weeks, or if there's a sleep and appetite disturbance, or if you're drinking too much or smoking too much or using other substances, seek help, right? So that's what an individual can do. What can you do for colleagues and friends? Be not judgmental. If you're judgmental of people who try and talk to you, or if you're dismissive about them, or if you start directing them, providing easy solutions, telling them to snap out of it, all that will not help. Be kind to people, listen to them, be empathetic, try and see it from their point of view, and signpost the resources for help. You can't provide help to everyone around you, but you can definitely be a conduit to seeking help and be a supportive person. Check in with people who are not seeming themselves or not looking themselves. It's all right to say, you're looking a bit off today. Do you want to talk about it? And it's all right to ask that 3 or 4 times if you have the capacity to do so. But what will help is what we as organized groups and as we as a country do. What are the lessons that we learn? And there the lessons are that mental health has to have parity with health. A significant proportion of the health budget needs to go into building mental health services, integrated into health services, and it needs to definitely include building up the human resource.
Do you think that will happen now? Do you see some movement towards that?
In the private sectors, to some extent. I talked about many companies coming up with providing digital health platforms for mental health. At a governmental level, I think resources will only trickle to mental health, right? Having said that, this time we did have a manual about how to intervene as quickly as we had a manual about vaccination and prevention.
Which is a sea change. We've not seen this earlier.
Yeah. So that it was a part of the conversation is a reality. But how do you change from that being in the recognition vocabulary of the policymaker to being in the operational vocabulary of the policymaker is again a wider jump. It's a quantum leap that we'll wait for.
And as a colleague, does your personal narration help? Because when we get physical illness, we say, oh, I broke a leg and, it's pretty similar to your injury and look, I'm fine now. Does that type of narration help, or does that actually make the situation worse by seeming, unempathetic?
It depends on whether you acknowledge the other person first, listen to the other person first, and then disclose about yourself. But because of the fear of discrimination and disclosure is anyway low. So if you feel up to it, do disclose about your mental health problems, like I said about my mother. But then what comes with it is that you should be ready to cope with possible discrimination. Or the other person might say, well, it's easy for you to talk about your problems, but my problems are not the same as yours. Comparing your difficulties to the other person's difficulties is not a very good thing to do.
My last question is, and I don't want to make this sound like pop science, but what are the top 5 tips that you would like to give to people going through a stressful time right now?
Gosh, that's a difficult one.
Yeah, that's why
I wish I had a recipe book for that. Accept yourself. That's the theme, right? How do you accept yourself? Accept that you have certain strengths. Accept that you have certain limitations. Accept that you can use your strengths to overcome your limitations, right? And then have some degree of balance in your life. Solve problems with seeking help. Be mindful about how you're feeling, what you're doing, and allow yourself that concession of being a human being. You're not God. You're not a celestial being. You're a human being, and there will be things which are less than perfect, and allow yourself that lack of perfection in your life.
Thank you, Dr. Bhagat, for joining us for this podcast, and it was really an enlightening experience. Thanks so much.
With that, we come to the end of this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. As Dr. Bhagat mentioned, if you feel that your mental health is disrupted, do talk to someone and get help. Remember, mental health issues are like any other. They need attention, both of an accepting patient and from a professional. Do encourage your friends and family to subscribe to our podcast. It helps our tribe to grow. Till the next episode, stay happy and healthy.
Indraprasth Apollo Hospitals presents The Prescription in association with Earshot.in.
Earshot, here and now.